Um, Susan Speakman. Bill, I believe you wrote the Tribes essay after Katrina, right? That's exactly right. Personally, I think it's one of the very best things you've ever done. Thank you. After this latest disaster, would you change anything about what you wrote in 2005? Would you add anything, or would you leave it exactly as written? I have to say this with a great deal of regret and sadness. I've had a few people say, "Why don't you just reissue Silent America?" And I say it's because it's not that country anymore. Silent America was essentially a very optimistic book. It was an extremely optimistic book. It was all about American exceptionalism and honor and integrity and the conduct of our soldiers. So, an extremely optimistic book. It was written before Barack Obama came to power, and 8 years later, it's 2005, I want to say, so 12 years later, it's not the same country. I couldn't reissue that book. I don't. It wouldn't make any sense. With that said, I do think that these tribes have split. And for those of you scalawags and layabouts and jackanapes who didn't read that magnificent essay called Tribes, um, I basically said the motivation for it was um, they were claiming that people were being murdered and raped and starved to death in the Superdome. That after Katrina in Louisiana, the Superdome, the giant football stadium down there, was was used to house a number of refugees, and conditions in there were just terrible. And I saw somebody either on TV or a comment basically saying, "This is America, racist America at its worst." And I remember thinking, if I'd been in there with my friends, we wouldn't be having rapes and murders in there. Turns out most of those stories were overblown, but at the time they seemed credible. Because because my people know how to ration food, and my people know how to protect innocent people, and my people know how to sterilize water for safe drinking. My people know how to construct a latrine and where to put it. My people know how to do all these things, and and that's when I realized this whole tribes thing. And I think the thing that I liked the most in terms of clarity was I didn't want to say red tribe and blue tribe because that doesn't mean anything. So the two colors for the tribes were pink and gray. I tried to pick two colors that the that the members of that group would say that's a good color for me, but mostly I tried to pick a color that would be something you simply could not abide to be if you were on the other side. People who are very liberal and very touchy-feely and emotional, the idea that their tribe was the gray tribe would be unthinkable to them. And likewise, people who are practical people would never want to be considered pink. It's just not the color they want. Um, so, um, so we had the gray tribe and the pink tribe, and I was talking about the kind of things I've been talking about, the kind of things that Evan Sayet later went on to talk about. And I'm not saying he derived it from me. He had a brilliant set of insights that he got on his own. Basically, he said liberals are good at rhetorical intelligence, and their jobs are jobs where you don't do anything. And if you don't do anything and you fail, it doesn't matter. There's no cost to it. So the jobs they go into are jobs where you can be wrong. You can be spectacularly wrong. Evan says you can not only be wrong, you can be consistently the opposite of the truth and still um, continue to work and get promoted, make more money. And those would be things like academia and journalism and movies. I mean, if you make a mistake as a movie director, you have a chance to go back and reshoot. And you'll probably get more money and bigger budget and all the rest of it. You make a mistake as an engineer, and a bridge comes down. And those are not equivalent in terms of impact. So I would keep the basics of it, Susan. I would keep the same essential division, and I think the division's gotten wider. I certainly am far better educated about these issues than I was when I wrote that book. I wrote it. Silent America essays were written in real time in terms of my development because I hadn't given any of this stuff any thought at all, ever. Um, I never have, and I just sat down and wrote them, and it was the feedback, it was the comments from people like you that kept me at it and made me think maybe this is important, which is still hard for me to believe. But so that those divisions are still there, but they're much more acute now. And the country, I'm going to do a firewall on this. I've got two coming up, and I think I mentioned the one on socialism, which I'm going to call friendlyism. I'm going to, because YouTube is restricting Prager University to 18 or older content. And so I'll tell the story of socialism as if I was talking to a 4-year-old, and I'm going to call it friendlyism. And the problem with friendlyism is that everybody likes to eat cookies, but not everybody likes to make cookies. Pretty simple, really. But the other one I'm going to be working on is about this new censorship. I was talking with Natasha about this last night. My life is so much better now than it used to be. We were walking around the neighborhood late at night before we went to bed. Great little neighborhood that we love, and she was talking about. She'd mentioned that she'd seen on Amazon. I guess you'd call it a novelty item, but basically it was a plastic little figurine of Donald Trump bent over, and it was a pencil sharpener, and you get to imagine where you put the pencil. And she said, if that had been in Russia and that had been Vladimir Putin, then the next day the company wouldn't exist. The company wouldn't exist, and the place that sold it probably wouldn't exist either. It would just be gone. You know, it just would not even necessarily murdered. In fact, almost certainly not murdered. But it would be made clear to everybody in the country that if you associate with these people, you won't have any of the business of the government. The government runs everything. So basically, it would not be tolerated. And I thought, well, that's freedom. I mean, you know, it's. I find it distasteful. If there'd been one of Barack Obama, I might have bought one for my dog, which I don't have. But in any event, that's freedom, the freedom to do that. And this is where I came to this conclusion that is just really kind of enlightening and also very alarming. And I was telling Natasha about the fact that freedom of speech and thought and freedom of those kind of actions are, in essence, the core of this entire society. The legal protections and constitutional protections are held highly by both sides on this one. And that government censorship of speech is one of the things that I think we still do to prevent very well. It's the third rail for Americans. If the government basically shuts down a printing press, then it's the third rail. That's it. Printing press, what an archaic idea. A blog site or something, or a news site or YouTube channel or something like that. In any event. And then I realized what the left has done. Eric M. Blake goes back to Yakov Smirnoff, one of the worst comedians who ever lived, and he says, "In Mother Russia, pencil sharpens you." Well played. It's really well played. And what I realized was this. I realized that what the left has done is they've achieved exactly what they want, but they didn't do it. They didn't do it the way we defended ourselves against it. We thought that censorship would come from the government. That's how it's always been done. The government doesn't like what you're printing, and so the printing goes away. That's Putin today and virtually every other country today, with a few exceptions. And that's the way it is. And so we put up these gigantic barriers, legal, emotional, psychological barriers to having that happen. And we thought, therefore, we're safe from censorship. But that's like having a fortified position and laying all of your machine guns and your barbed wire and your claymore mines, and the artillery's all zeroed in and everything, because they're going to be coming in from the sea. And just like in Singapore, it turns out they're not coming in from the sea. They're coming in from the jungle behind us, and they could not turn the guns around physically. The guns were not designed. They could not turn the guns on Singapore from out to sea back to the hills in the jungle where the Japanese came from. In other words, the left got their censorship, but they got it through infiltration. And what I mean by that is this. They have achieved absolute censorship in America, and I'm not silenced by the government, and you're not either, but they've made it so that if you do speak your mind, your life as you know it is essentially over if you hold opinions that they don't like. And they have made any thought that is contrary to their beliefs not only wrong, but so evil and reprehensible that you simply are no longer a human being if you hold those rights. For example, let's say you have a small little bakery, and let's say that a gay couple comes in and says they'd like a cake, and you say, okay, sure, we'd be happy to bake a cake, and they say they want you to deliver it to their wedding, and you say, I'm sorry, I don't want to do that. That's against my religious beliefs. The government didn't throw them in jail for that. They didn't have to. I don't know what the final outcome was then, but they basically lost their business. They basically shut them down. They shut them down through public outrage and all the rest of it, because all they said was, no, I prefer not to deliver this cake. We'll make the cake, but we prefer not to deliver it because we don't particularly care for that. Now you have to ask yourself, how would a big liberal, giant progressive liberal, let's say an elderly Jewish woman, and you told her that she had to bake a cake for Nazis and had to deliver it to the Nazi Party rally, and she decided she didn't want to do that, well, that would be understandable, and she'd be a hero and all the rest of it. So it's a question of the left deciding what is what. That woman could decline delivering it to a Nazi rally and everybody would be sympathetic to her. But if she declined to deliver it to a Communist Party rally, she'd be a red-baiting McCarthyite. And this kind of gets to something a little interesting. Well, it looks like my feed over there has frozen. I'm just going to hope that is just buffering, because I got good outgoing thing here. Which leads me to something that is really kind of remarkable. And it was a book called Koba the Dread. Koba was the name that Stalin used. It was kind of his nom de guerre. Although I've promised myself I'm not going to speak any more French because I don't know anymore. But basically, Stalin had a name. His name was, the nickname, his underground name before he became Stalin was Koba. And Koba was a dashing, brigand in some awful novel that he read as a kid, but he liked it. So Kingsley Amos's son, Martin Amos, wrote a book called Koba the Dread, Laughter and the 20 Million. And what he basically says is, no one laughs at Nazism, but everybody laughs at communism. And communism killed 3 times as many people as Nazism. Why is that? Why do people feel a moral reprehension toward, is that a word? Just they see the swastika and they feel sick. But they see the hammer and sickle, or they see, Communist Party USA, and they laugh. And he couldn't really figure it out. But it's true. And the communists, the Bolsheviks, I suppose I should say, targeted their entire population. They may have killed 10% of their total population. They starved the peasants to death. They starved the kulaks to death. And then they basically turned against against members of the security organs and purged those guys, got some new guys in, then they decapitated the Red Army and killed all of their commanders, and all the people knew what they were doing, and so on and so on and so on. It looks like Stalin was about to launch one of these things against the Russian Jews, but sadly for the fate of the world, he died of a stroke before he could pull that off. So why is it that people are proud to be communists, socialists? Why? How can that be? Whenever I see somebody who talks about how wonderful socialism is, I make them account for the 100 million people that it's killed. That's where we're going to start. You're championing a system that's killed 100 million people. So we're going to start with those people. And why did those people have to die? And why don't they count? My philosophy doesn't require killing people. In fact, my philosophy is that if I find a government that is killing people, then it's my duty, it's my moral duty to oppose that group of murderers. But that's not That's not where it goes. It's always the same thing. Well, they didn't do it right. They didn't do it right. That's not real. That's not real socialism. That's communism. Not real socialism. Stalin perverted Lenin's revolution. Stalin picked up the reins where Lenin dropped them. Lenin had arrested people and had executed people who he knew were innocent. Absolutely knew were innocent. He would say, go 100 miles into Polish territory, take a bunch of hostages, and if anybody acts up, shoot 10% of them. He was just a mass murderer. He looked at people as just tokens. They weren't even coins or gears. They were just tokens or a little piece of plastic here. Lenin was an appalling man. He was just absolutely appalling. And Stalin is the logical outcome of Lenin. And this is what happens when you give intellectuals unlimited power. And I'll tell you something else. The tragedy of Russia was that they were so close, They were so close. They had 2 revolutions in 1 year. The February Revolution, they overthrew the Tsar, Nicholas II. And the Kerensky government had set up a parliament, and there was abolition of the death penalty, and there was protection of rights, freedom of the press. All of these things were written into the Constitution, and the Bolsheviks kept delaying and destroying and arguing and so on. And then in October of the same year, the Bolsheviks launched a second revolution, which brought communism to Russia and doomed them for 70 years. And they're not over it now, and they won't get over it for centuries. But they were close. They were very close. And the Bolshevik Revolution happened, and I think it was the next day, because literally they did it in an evening. There was just nobody in charge, and they just went out there and took over. But I think it was literally the next day when the Constituent Assembly, which was going to be the Russian Congress, was to meet, and the Bolsheviks dissolved it on the first day. What do we need a Congress for? We're the party of the people. We're the vanguard of the workers. This is the dictatorship of the proletariat. And instead of murdering people by what religion they were, they murdered people by what economic class they were. Didn't have anything to do with guilt, innocence, nothing. If you were an aristocrat or a member of the bourgeoisie, you're largely finished. And if you're a proletarian, then you've got some protection against you. It didn't protect you individually, but as a class, it made you a little less of a target. I don't see the difference between murdering 100 million people because of class and murdering 6 million people because of religion. I don't see the ethical difference. And I don't understand why Nazism... I fully understand why Nazism is so repugnant. I don't understand why communism has been given such a pass. And the reason is because it's the philosophy of the left, and the left controls the media. That's where all the rhetorical people go. And people like, Don Cheadle and Mark Ruffalo and so on don't know anything about anything. And so they think that this is kindness, when in point of fact, it's just nothing but misery. And off you go. I think I'll do one more.